often as we consider our move to Office 365 and we're focusing specifically on Exchange, we're going to have existing content somewhere. They could be in an Exchange on-prem, they could be Gmail, they could be Outlook, they could be Hotmail for all we know. So what we need to do is understand, how can I get our current content into Exchange Online? And that's what we're going to address in this module here. We're going to look at the different options that we have available to us for mailbox migration. And we have about a half a dozen. We have one called Remote Move, Stage. And I mentioned this one already. We have 10,000 users on-prem. We don't want to bring all 10,000 users over to Exchange Online at once. We're going to do that in stages. We'll talk more about each of these in detail and when we'll want to use each of these, like the cutover, the hybrid approach. IMAP, if we have a mailbox, it's kind of unique. It's not an Exchange on-prem. And we also have a flat-up import service that allows us to migrate content. We'll look at all of these in some detail. We'll also look at the methods that we have available to us. So like everything else in Office 365, or on-prem for that matter, we have a PowerShell option and we have a web user interface. So we can perform these tasks using either of these tools or methods, as you'll see as we move through this module. And the first option that we have is called the Remote Move Migration. And there's a few things to take into consideration here. The first is that you have to have already configured a hybrid deployment for your Exchange environment. So you have to have configured a hybrid to be able to communicate between on-prem and online. You also have to make sure that this hybrid configuration is configured for Skype for Business, that's the S for B, for moving your unified messaging mailboxes. So be aware of that requirement as well. And thirdly, if you're communicating with Exchange 2013 on-prem, your on-prem configuration requires what's called the MRS proxy for that to be enabled. And that's the Mailbox Replication Proxy Service. And that's going to manage the communication between on-prem and online. Now, the steps to do this are pretty straightforward. First off, you're going to create a migration endpoint. And this endpoint contains the connection settings for your on-prem Exchange server that's running that MRS proxy service that we just introduced. So which means we'll need to enable that MRS proxy service on-prem. Step 3 is to use the Remote Move Migration Wizard, which is part of the Exchange Admin Center, and that's going to migrate those mailboxes. Your fourth step is going to go do some cleanup. You're going to remove the completed migration batches. The fifth step is to re-enable the offline access for the Outlook on the web. Remember I mentioned OWA Outlook Web Access has been renamed? There you have it, Outlook on the web. And the last step is to verify the migration was successful, and you can do that by going into the Office 365 Admin Center, making sure everything's there, or you can run a PowerShell command called get-migration batch -identity, and then the batch name that was specified when you perform the migration. So these are the 6 steps necessary to complete a migration from on-prem to Office 365 or Exchange Online using the remote move. Our next option is one that you'll want to use under specific conditions. And that means if you're running Exchange 2003 or Exchange 2007, or if you have more than 2,000 mailboxes, this will be an opportunity for you to use the stage migration. If you're going to do so, you're going to have to perform a synchronization between your Active Directory on-prem and Office 365. You're only going to get the user and resource mailboxes migrated. You're not going to get distribution lists or contacts or anything like that. So be aware of what's actually being migrated. To improve performance, you're going to want to make sure that you have unlimited connections to your on-premises server. That way it'll expedite the migration. And it's also going to require that the user create an Office 365 Outlook profile. And that will occur the very first time that they log in. So these are the considerations for stage migration. Now, how do we do this? Well, it's an 8-step process. We're going to synchronize our list of on-premise users to O365. We're going to create a CSV file that's going to contain all the users that we want to migrate. We're going to use the migration dashboard that's going to run this stage migration. What this does, it creates the Exchange Online account for each user, and it configures mail forwarding for each user that's contained in that CSV file. And at this point, our users can actually start using Exchange Online mailboxes. We're going to review to make sure the migration took place correctly. That's done in step 4. And then step 5 will include the synchronization of the messages and the contacts and the calendar items. And then step 6, we're going to convert the on-premises mailbox to mail-enabled. And finally, in step 7, after you've converted your on-premises mailboxes to mail-enabled users, the auto discovery service uses the mail-enabled user to connect to Outlook in Exchange Online mailbox after that user creates its new Outlook profile, and that's going to take place the very first time that they log in. And then we need to complete our post-migration tasks in step 8. Our users, if they're not licensed, need to be licensed. And we're also going to configure the DNS MX record to point to your Office 365 organization so that email is delivered directly to Exchange Online. In addition to that, you're going to create an auto-discover DNS record for your Office 365 organization, and you'll perform these steps for each batch of users being migrated using this approach. Remember, we're not going to do all 10,000 users at once. We're going to do this for groups of users over a period of time. Well, next up is another migration option, and this one is going to be referred to as the cutover migration. Let's take a peek at some of those considerations. First off, you need to be running Exchange 2003 or higher, pretty basic requirement. Maximum of 2,000 mailboxes in your Exchange on-prem. Remember, the previous one that we talked about was if you had more than 2,000 mailboxes. Well, now we are saying you can't have any more than 2,000, and that little asterisk right there, that's really the maximum. We really are recommending about 150. So not really pushing the 2,000, but this is really good for about 150 users. The primary domain name of your on-prem Exchange has to be accepted by the Office 365 organization. You can set up a second domain name in Office 365 as long as you own that domain. Then after the migration, you're going to again assign Office 365 licenses to each on-prem migrated user. So those are considerations for a cutover migration. And we have 6 steps to perform this cutover migration. First off, educate. Tell your users what's happening, when it's happening, how they're going to sign in, and what they can expect differently when they access their email. And I already mentioned, verify the ownership of the domain for use in Office 365. You have to register that domain, and you have to have a couple of DNS records in order to do so. You're going to create empty mail-enabled security groups in Office 365. You'll establish a connection between Office 365 and on-prem. You'll perform the migration and check the status of the mailbox migration. And then you'll again complete post-migration tasks. And this would include assigning licenses, configuring the domain to route email to Office 365, and again creating that auto-discover DNS record as we did when we performed the staged migration.